He thought destroying her reputation would be effortless. Just another quiet woman to silence in a courtroom built for men like him. But Judge William Harrington had no idea he was about to lose control of the very system he believed he owned. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished oak floors as the courtroom filled with low murmurs and shifting bodies. People leaned in their seats, whispering behind folded hands, curious but already convinced of what they were about to witness. At the center of it all stood Emma Carter, dressed in a simple navy cardigan and modest heels, her posture straight but unassuming, the kind of woman most people overlooked without a second thought. And that was exactly why no one noticed the stillness in her eyes, the kind that didn't belong to someone afraid. Judge Harrington adjusted his robe as he entered, his presence commanding immediate silence. His reputation preceded him, decisive, unchallenged, and quietly feared, a man who rarely lost and never tolerated being questioned, especially not by someone like her. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone measured but edged with condescension. "You stand before this court accused of financial misconduct and falsification of records." The words echoed sharply, deliberate, designed not just to inform but to diminish. A few people in the gallery exchanged knowing glances. Others shook their heads softly as if the outcome had already been written. Emma didn't respond, not immediately. She simply stood there, hands lightly clasped, her breathing steady, and that silence stretched just a second too long, enough to make a few heads tilt, enough to plant the smallest seed of unease. The prosecutor stepped forward confidently, presenting a stack of neatly organized documents, signatures highlighted, timelines aligned. Everything appeared flawless, too flawless, like a story that had been rehearsed rather than lived. "The evidence is clear," he stated firmly, his voice carrying across the room. "A pattern of intentional deception." Harrington nodded slightly, satisfied. This was proceeding exactly as planned. Control was intact, the narrative unchallenged. But then something subtle shifted. Emma lifted her gaze, not toward the prosecutor, but directly at the judge, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to tighten. "Your Honor," she said softly, her voice calm but unmistakably steady. "I would like to represent myself." A ripple moved through the courtroom, a few quiet chuckles, a raised eyebrow from the clerk. Even Harrington allowed himself a faint smile, the kind reserved for inevitable mistakes. "That is your right," he replied, almost amused, "though I would advise against it." Emma gave a small nod, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, and stepped forward by exactly one pace. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed, yet every eye followed her movement without understanding why. "Before we proceed," she continued, her tone unchanged, "may I ask on what basis this evidence was admitted without independent verification of procedural integrity?" The words landed with unexpected weight, precise, controlled, and completely out of place for someone they had already dismissed. The prosecutor blinked, just once, caught off guard. Harrington's fingers paused lightly against the bench, and in that fraction of a second, the room fell into a deeper silence, not the silence of boredom or routine, but the kind that comes when something unseen begins to shift beneath the surface. Emma lowered her hand slowly, her expression unchanged, as if she had merely asked a simple question. But the truth was already unfolding, quietly, methodically, and for the first time that morning, Judge Harrington felt something he hadn't expected, not doubt, not yet, but the faintest crack in certainty, and the room, though no one said it out loud, was no longer sure who was on trial. The silence did not break immediately. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if the entire courtroom was waiting for someone to restore the balance they had always trusted. But no one moved, not even Judge Harrington, whose fingers now rested motionless against the polished wood of the bench, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Emma Carter with a new kind of attention, not curiosity, not yet respect, but something closer to calculation. The prosecutor cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim control. "The evidence was submitted in accordance with standard procedure," he said. Though his voice had lost a fraction of its earlier certainty, Emma turned her head just enough to acknowledge him, her expression calm, almost neutral. "Standard procedure requires chain of custody documentation and independent verification for financial records exceeding $10,000. she replied, her tone measured, precise. These documents represent amounts well beyond that threshold. Yet no such verification has been presented. A faint murmur rippled through the gallery, subtle, but undeniable. A few heads leaned closer together, whispering now not with dismissal, but with uncertainty. The prosecutor shuffled the papers in his hand, flipping through pages that moments ago had seemed airtight, now suddenly incomplete. The verification is implied within the submission, he insisted. Though the words sounded weaker as they left his mouth, Emma did not interrupt. She allowed the statement to settle, allowed the room to hear it fully, before she spoke again. Implied verification is not admissible under Section 803 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, she said, her voice still soft, but carrying effortlessly across the room, especially in cases involving alleged intent. The clerk paused mid-note, her pen hovering above the page. Judge Harrington leaned back slightly in his chair, the faintest crease forming between his brows. This was no longer proceeding as expected. Miss Carter, he said, his voice firmer now, attempting to reassert authority. You are not here to lecture this court on procedural standards. Emma met his gaze without hesitation. Not defiant, not emotional, simply steady. No, Your Honor, she replied. I am here to ensure that those standards are applied. The words landed differently than anything else that morning. Not confrontational, but undeniable. A statement of purpose rather than challenge. And for a brief moment, no one spoke. The air in the courtroom seemed heavier, charged with something that had not been present before. The quiet assumption of guilt was beginning to fracture, replaced by a question no one had anticipated. What if this case was not as simple as it seemed? The prosecutor attempted to move forward, calling attention back to the timeline, the signatures, the apparent inconsistencies in Emma's financial records. But now each point felt less like proof, and more like something that needed defending. Emma listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her eyes focused, as if she were not reacting to the argument, but analyzing it, piece by piece. And when he finished, expecting resistance or confusion, she simply nodded once, a small, deliberate motion. Then let us examine the origin of these documents, she said quietly, lifting a single page from the stack, her fingers steady. Because if the foundation is flawed, everything built upon it collapses. The statement hung in the air, simple, logical, impossible to ignore, and as she placed the document on the stand, aligning it carefully under the light, something shifted again, deeper this time, the kind of shift that does not announce itself, but changes everything. And in that moment, Judge Harrington realized that this was no longer a matter of controlling the room. It was a matter of understanding what he had failed to see from the very beginning. The document rested under the overhead light, its edges perfectly aligned, its contents now carrying a weight it did not seem to have just moments ago. And as Emma Carter's fingers released it, the room leaned in without realizing it, drawn by a quiet confidence that no longer matched the image they had formed of her. Judge Harrington watched closely, his expression controlled, but the stillness in his posture betrayed a growing awareness that something had shifted beyond his reach. Please read the signature line aloud, Emma said calmly, her voice directed not at the judge, but at the prosecutor, who hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying. Authorized by Emma Carter, he read, his tone regaining some firmness as if anchoring himself to the familiar. Emma nodded slightly, then tilted her head just enough to indicate the lower corner of the page. And the timestamp, she added. The prosecutor glanced down, his eyes narrowing as he focused. Dated March 12th, at 9:42 in the morning. Emma's gaze did not waver. Now, could you confirm for the court the location where this document was allegedly signed? The prosecutor straightened, flipping briefly through his notes. According to the record, it was signed at the downtown financial office, he answered, confident again. Emma allowed a small pause, just long enough for the words to settle into the air, before she reached into her folder and retrieved another document, placing it beside the first with deliberate precision. Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit B, she said, her tone steady. The clerk accepted it, passing it forward. Harrington glanced down, his eyes scanning quickly, then again more slowly, the faint crease between his brows deepening. This is a verified employment log, Emma continued, certified by the school district where I have been employed for the past 10 years. A quiet murmur began to rise again, softer this time, more cautious. On March 12th, at 9:42 in the morning, she continued, her voice unwavering. I was teaching a full class of 32 students, in a classroom monitored by both attendance records and security systems. The words landed with a quiet precision that left little room for interpretation. The prosecutor's hand tightened slightly around his papers. That does not necessarily invalidate the signature, he interjected, though his voice now carried a trace of strain. Emma turned toward him fully for the first time, her expression composed. It does if the document requires physical presence for authorization, which this one does, she replied, her tone not confrontational, but definitive. The room fell still again, deeper. This time, as if even the air had paused to listen, Judge Harrington leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the two documents now side by side. The alignment too clean, the contradiction too clear. Are you suggesting fabrication? He asked, his voice measured, but lacking the earlier certainty. Emma met his eyes without hesitation. I am suggesting that the origin of this document does not align with verifiable reality, she said, choosing each word with care, and in that moment, the shift became undeniable. The narrative that had once seemed so certain was beginning to unravel, thread by thread, and the room, once so eager to witness a simple conclusion, now sat in complete silence, watching as the foundation beneath the case began to crack. And for the first time since the proceedings began, Judge Harrington did not immediately speak, because somewhere beneath the surface of control and authority, a realization was forming, quiet but unavoidable, that this was no longer a case he could simply direct. It was a truth he might not be able to contain. The weight of the moment did not explode. It settled, heavy and undeniable, pressing down on every person in the courtroom as the two documents remained side by side under the light, one claiming a truth that the other quietly dismantled. And for a long second no one spoke, not the prosecutor, not the clerk, not even the spectators who had come expecting something simple, something predictable. Judge Harrington finally leaned forward, his voice measured, but no longer effortless. This discrepancy requires clarification, he said, though the authority in his tone now felt more procedural than absolute. The prosecutor quickly stepped in, sensing the shift and attempting to regain footing. There may be an administrative delay or an error in logging, he offered, his words carefully chosen but lacking conviction. Emma Carter did not respond immediately. She allowed the explanation to exist in the air, incomplete. Before she reached again into her folder, her movements calm, deliberate, never rushed, as if time itself had slowed to match her pace. Your Honor, if I may continue, she said, receiving a brief nod. She placed a third document onto the stand, aligning it with the others, creating a quiet pattern of order that contrasted sharply with the growing disorder of the argument against her. This is the access log from the downtown financial office, she explained. It records every authorized entry into the signing room on that date. A subtle shift moved through the gallery, not noise, but attention sharpening. Please read the entries between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, she said, her gaze resting on the prosecutor once more. He hesitated, then complied, scanning the page, his eyes moving line by line, slower than before. There are no entries under your name, Emma said gently, before he could respond, not interrupting, but completing the thought that the room had already begun to form. The prosecutor's lips parted slightly, then closed again, the explanation he had reached for moments ago now slipping further out of reach. Judge Harrington's expression tightened, not dramatically, but enough for those watching closely to notice, a subtle fracture in the confidence that had defined him from the start. Records can be incomplete, he stated, though the words sounded more like an attempt to stabilize the moment than a firm conclusion. Emma nodded once, acknowledging the possibility. Yes, Your Honor, they can, she said, her tone respectful, which is why I also requested the internal security summary, she added, sliding one final document forward. The clerk handed it up, and this time Harrington did not rush his glance. He read it carefully, his eyes scanning each line, each timestamp, each detail that now painted a clearer picture than any argument could. The room remained completely still, the kind of silence that no longer felt passive, but aware. Watching, waiting, and when Harrington finally looked up, something in his gaze had changed, not fully, not yet, but enough to signal that control was no longer one-sided. Emma stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, not triumphant, not defensive, simply present, and in that presence was a quiet certainty that did not need to be announced. At 9:42, she said softly, her voice the only sound in the room. No one entered that room, and no document was signed. The statement did not rise. It settled, like a final piece placed into position, and for the first time since the proceedings began, the narrative that had once seemed so carefully constructed no longer held together. It was not broken loudly, not shattered, but undone with precision, and in the silence that followed, Judge Harrington realized that what he was facing was not resistance. It was clarity, and clarity was something far more difficult to control. The silence did not break this time. It deepened, settling over the courtroom like something final, something that could not be undone, and every person in the room felt it. The quiet realization that what had begun as a simple accusation was no longer holding together. Judge Harrington remained still, his gaze fixed on the documents before him, but the authority that once defined his presence now felt restrained, measured, as if even he understood that any misstep would expose more than it concealed. The prosecutor shifted his weight, his confidence unraveling in subtle ways, the tightening of his jaw, the hesitation before each word. Your Honor, these inconsistencies do not negate the entirety of the evidence, he said, though the argument now sounded like an echo of something that had already lost its foundation. Emma Carter did not react immediately. She allowed the statement to settle, her eyes moving briefly across the room, taking in the faces that had once judged her without hesitation, now uncertain, now waiting, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm precision that had begun to reshape everything. No, they do not negate everything, she said, her tone steady. But they do establish a pattern. The word lingered, drawing attention without force. A pattern of documentation that does not align with verifiable records. A pattern of submissions that bypass required safeguards. And most importantly, a pattern of assumptions. She paused, just long enough for the room to follow her reasoning. Assumptions about what would go unquestioned. The prosecutor opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, as if searching for something that no longer existed. Judge Harrington leaned back slightly, his fingers now interlocked, his posture composed but no longer dominant. Miss Carter, he said, his voice lower, more deliberate. Are you suggesting that this case was constructed on false premises? Emma met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged. I am suggesting that the integrity of this case depends entirely on documents that fail to meet the standards required for admission, she replied, each word placed carefully, leaving no room for distortion. The room remained completely still, the kind of silence that no longer needed to be acknowledged because it had become the only possible response. Emma took a small step forward, not to confront, but to clarify. And if the foundation of a case cannot be verified, she continued, then every conclusion drawn from it must be questioned. The statement did not rise. It settled, like a line drawn that could not be ignored. The prosecutor's shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly, the fight draining not through defeat, but through the absence of ground to stand on. Judge Harrington exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting once more to the documents, then back to Emma. And for the first time since the proceedings began, there was no trace of dismissal in his expression, only the weight of something he could no longer control, because what stood before him was not defiance, not emotion, but clarity, structured, precise, and impossible to dismiss. And as the courtroom remained suspended in that silence, one truth became unavoidable. This was no longer a case being presented, it was a narrative being undone, piece by piece. And the person he had expected to silence had instead become the only one speaking with undeniable authority. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. It had taken form, settling into every corner of the courtroom like a truth that refused to stay hidden. And as Emma Carter stood there, composed and unwavering, it became clear that what had once been a straightforward proceeding had transformed into something far more fragile. Judge Harrington straightened slightly, reclaiming posture but not fully regaining control, his voice measured, slower now. Miss Carter, your observations raise concerns about the admissibility of certain documents, he said, choosing each word carefully. But concerns alone do not dismantle a case. The statement lingered, an attempt to restore structure, to draw a boundary between doubt and conclusion. Emma inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the point without conceding it. No, Your Honor, they do not, she replied calmly. But they do require us to examine who introduced those documents and under what authority. The words redirected the focus, not outward, but inward, toward the origin rather than the outcome. A quiet ripple passed through the gallery as attention shifted once again. The prosecutor adjusted his stance, his earlier confidence now replaced by something more cautious. The documents were submitted through proper legal channels, he said. Though his voice carried less certainty than before, Emma did not interrupt. She waited, allowing the statement to settle, then stepped closer to the stand by a single measured pace. Then we should have no difficulty identifying the source, she said softly, her tone unchanged, yet the implication clear. She turned slightly, her gaze moving not across the room, but directly toward the clerk's desk. May the court confirm who authorized the initial filing. The request was simple, procedural, impossible to dismiss without explanation. The clerk hesitated briefly, her fingers pausing above the record, then began to scan through the entries. The faint sound of paper shifting seemed louder than it should have been, drawing every ear toward it. The filing was approved under judicial authorization, she said carefully, her eyes moving once more to confirm. Signed electronically by the presiding judge. The words landed with a quiet weight that carried further than any raised voice. The prosecutor's gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, then lifted again, but this time without the same certainty. Emma did not react immediately. She allowed the statement to exist fully, to be understood, before she spoke again, her voice steady, almost gentle. And that authorization would have required a preliminary review of the evidence, she said, her eyes now returning to Judge Harrington, not accusatory, not confrontational, but direct. The room fell completely silent, the kind of silence that no longer questioned what was happening, but recognized it. Harrington's expression remained composed, but the stillness in his posture had changed, no longer controlled, but deliberate, as if weighing each response against something larger than the moment itself. That is standard procedure, he replied, though the words felt measured, cautious. Emma nodded once, her hands resting lightly at her sides. Then the issue before us is not simply whether the evidence is flawed, she continued, her tone unwavering, but how it passed through a process designed to prevent exactly this kind of inconsistency. The statement did not accuse. It revealed, and in doing so, it shifted the center of the room. Entirely, no longer focused on her, but on the system that had placed her there, and more specifically, on the one who had overseen it. The prosecutor remained silent now, no longer attempting to steer the narrative, because the direction had already changed. And as the weight of that realization settled over the courtroom, Judge Harrington understood something that could not be spoken aloud, that this was no longer a matter of authority, it was a matter of accountability. And for the first time, the distance between those two things had become impossible to ignore. The air in the courtroom had changed completely now, no longer heavy with assumption but sharpened by awareness, and every person seated within those walls could feel it, the quiet shift from certainty to scrutiny, from judgment to observation. Judge Harrington remained still for a long moment, his gaze fixed forward but no longer commanding, as if he were recalibrating every word before allowing it to leave his mouth. Miss Carter, he said finally, his voice controlled, but noticeably slower. You are implying that the court itself failed in its duty to properly evaluate the evidence presented. The statement was careful, deliberate, framed not as a defense but as a boundary. Emma Carter did not react immediately. She let the words settle into the room, allowing everyone present to hear them fully, to understand their weight, before she responded. I am not implying failure, Your Honor, she said calmly, her tone steady. I am identifying a sequence of events that does not align with the standards this court is sworn to uphold. The distinction was subtle but powerful. shifting the conversation away from accusation and toward undeniable structure. A faint murmur moved through the gallery, not loud, but present, as if the room itself was beginning to follow her reasoning step by step. The prosecutor remained silent, his earlier attempts to steer the narrative now completely absent. Because there was nothing left to redirect, Emma took another measured breath, her posture unchanged, her presence unwavering. If the documents were flawed and the verification incomplete, she continued, then the approval process becomes the critical point of review. She paused briefly, not for effect, but to allow the logic to settle, because that is where the responsibility shifts from submission to authorization. Judge Harrington's fingers tightened slightly against the bench, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal the pressure beneath his composed exterior. You are stepping into a very serious assertion, he replied, his tone firm, but lacking the certainty that had defined him earlier. Emma met his gaze without hesitation, her eyes steady, not confrontational, but clear. No, Your Honor, she said quietly. I am stepping into a necessary one. The words landed without force, yet they carried further than anything spoken before. The room fell into complete silence once again. Deeper now, more focused, as if every person present understood that something fundamental was being revealed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with precision that could not be dismissed. Emma did not raise her voice. She did not rush her words. She simply continued. Because if the process that ensures fairness is compromised, even unintentionally, then the outcome can no longer be trusted. The statement settled into the room like a final alignment of truth, and for a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Not even the faint shuffle of papers could be heard. Judge Harrington exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering briefly to the documents before him, then lifting again to meet hers. And in that moment, something unmistakable passed between them. Not agreement, not yet, but recognition, the kind that comes when control is no longer absolute, when authority must answer to something greater than itself. And as the silence held, unbroken and undeniable, it became clear to everyone present that this was no longer about a case being defended or prosecuted. It was about a system being examined, and the person who had once seemed the least powerful in the room had become the one guiding that examination with a clarity no one could ignore. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt deliberate, like a collective decision to listen more carefully than before. And as Emma Carter stood there without moving, without raising her voice, the entire courtroom seemed to shift around her presence. Judge Harrington adjusted his posture once more, but this time the movement carried a different weight, not authority, but awareness, his voice steady but slower than before. Miss Carter, you have questioned the process, the evidence, and now the authorization itself, he said, each word carefully measured. But questioning alone does not establish intent. The statement hung in the air, an attempt to anchor the discussion in something concrete, something that could still be controlled. Emma inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the point without resistance. That is correct, Your Honor, she replied, her tone calm. Intent must be demonstrated, not assumed. The words were simple, but they redirected the focus once again, narrowing the scope from broad concern to precise examination. A faint shift moved through the gallery as attention sharpened further, no longer waiting for drama, but for detail. Emma took a slow breath, her eyes briefly lowering to the documents before lifting again, steady and clear. Which is why the sequence matters, she continued, her voice even, because intent is revealed through pattern, and pattern is revealed through repetition. The phrasing carried a quiet rhythm, drawing the room deeper into her reasoning without force. Judge Harrington remained still, his gaze fixed on her now, no longer scanning, no longer dismissing, simply listening. The documents were submitted without proper verification, Emma said. They were accepted without independent review, and they were authorized despite inconsistencies that should have been identified. She paused briefly, allowing each step to settle before continuing. That is not a single oversight. It is a chain. The word lingered, connecting each piece into something larger, something structured. The prosecutor shifted slightly, his earlier presence now reduced to observation, unable to interrupt without unraveling further. Emma did not look at him. Her focus remained forward, unwavering. And in any legal process, she added, a chain is only as reliable as its weakest link. The statement landed with quiet precision, the kind that did not demand attention but commanded it. Judge Harrington's fingers tightened once more, then relaxed, a subtle motion that did not go unnoticed by those watching closely. You are suggesting a systemic failure, he said, his tone lower now, less declarative, more cautious. Emma met his gaze, her expression unchanged. No, Your Honor, she replied softly. I am suggesting that the system functioned exactly as it was allowed to. The distinction was immediate, and it carried further than any accusation could have. The room fell into complete stillness, deeper than before, because the implication was no longer abstract. It was specific, grounded, undeniable. Emma stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but creating space, as if allowing the weight of what had been said to fully settle. If safeguards are bypassed, she continued, not once, but repeatedly, then the issue is not the rule itself, but the point at which it was no longer enforced. Her voice remained calm, but the clarity within it had sharpened, and as she spoke, the focus of the room shifted again, no longer circling the evidence, but centering on the moment of approval, the moment where everything had passed through a single decision. Judge Harrington did not respond immediately, his gaze lowering briefly, then returning to meet hers, and in that exchange, something became unmistakably clear. The distance between authority and accountability had narrowed to almost nothing, and as the silence held, unbroken and complete, the courtroom understood what was coming next, not because it had been announced, but because it had been built, step by step, with a precision that could no longer be undone. The room did not shift this time. It held, suspended in a quiet tension that no one dared to break, as if every person present understood that the next words would not simply continue the argument, they would define it. Emma Carter remained still, her posture composed, her presence no longer overlooked but centered, and for the first time since the proceedings began, no one saw her as the defendant. Judge Harrington exhaled slowly, his gaze steady but no longer dominant. You have outlined a sequence, he said, his voice measured, deliberate. But a sequence alone does not establish responsibility. The statement was careful, an attempt to draw a line between process and accountability. Emma inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the distinction. That is correct, Your Honor, she replied calmly. Responsibility must be connected through action. The words were precise, narrowing the focus once more, guiding the room forward step by step. She turned slightly toward the documents, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the stand. We have established that the documents were inconsistent, that they bypassed required safeguards, and that they were authorized despite those inconsistencies. She continued, her tone steady. The remaining question is not whether this happened, but how it happened. The phrasing shifted the perspective again, away from doubt and toward mechanism. The prosecutor remained silent, his role now reduced to observation. Unable to intervene without reinforcing her structure, Emma lifted one of the documents, holding it just enough for the court to see. Each submission carries a digital authorization trail, she said, her voice calm but clear. A record that identifies not only who approved it, but when and under what credentials. A subtle movement passed through the gallery, not noise, but recognition, as if the missing piece was beginning to take shape. Judge Harrington's gaze followed the document, his expression controlled, but the stillness in his posture now carried weight. The court is aware of standard authorization protocols, he replied. Though his tone lacked the firmness it once held, Emma nodded slightly. Then the court will also be aware that such authorizations cannot be delegated without recorded oversight, she said, her eyes returning to meet his, steady, unflinching. The room fell into complete silence, deeper than before, because the implication was no longer indirect. It was approaching something undeniable. Emma did not raise her voice. She did not rush. She simply continued, which means that every approval in this case traces back to a single point of origin. The words landed softly, but they carried a gravity that filled the room. Judge Harrington's fingers pressed lightly against the bench, then stilled, his gaze no longer shifting, no longer searching, simply fixed. as if he understood exactly where this was leading. Emma placed the document back down with careful precision, aligning it once more with the others, maintaining the order that now stood in contrast to everything it revealed. And when a process fails at multiple stages, she added, her tone unwavering, the point of origin is not just relevant, it becomes central. The statement settled into the room like a final alignment of logic, the kind that did not demand agreement, but made disagreement impossible. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence now complete, not empty, but filled with understanding. And in that stillness, the distance between question and answer had nearly disappeared, leaving only one step remaining, one connection that could no longer be avoided. And as Emma lifted her gaze once more, meeting Judge Harrington's eyes without hesitation, it became clear that the structure she had built was no longer theoretical, it was pointing, directly and unmistakably, toward the one person who had believed himself beyond question. The final step did not arrive with noise, it arrived with stillness, the kind that settles when every piece is already in place and only needs to be seen. Emma Carter did not move for a moment, allowing the weight of her last words to fully take hold, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had already accepted where this would lead. Judge Harrington remained motionless, his gaze fixed, forward, but no longer distant, no longer detached. The control that once defined him now replaced by a quiet tension that could not be concealed. Miss Carter, he said slowly, his voice measured, each word deliberate. You are approaching a conclusion that carries significant implications. The statement was not a warning, not quite, but something close, an attempt to contain what could no longer be easily redirected. Emma inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the weight without retreating from it. Yes, Your Honor, she replied calmly, because the structure of this case leads to only one conclusion. The words did not rise, they settled, firm and precise. The room remained completely silent, not a single movement, not a single whisper, every eye fixed on the space between them, where authority and truth now stood face to face. Emma took a small step forward, not to challenge, but to clarify, her voice steady, unwavering. If the documents were submitted improperly, if they bypassed verification, and if they were authorized through a single point of origin, she said, each condition placed carefully, building not tension, but inevitability, then the integrity of this case does not fail at the surface, it fails at its source. The statement landed with quiet force, not dramatic, but undeniable. Judge Harrington's fingers tightened slightly against the bench, a subtle movement, but one that did not go unnoticed. His expression remained composed, but the certainty that once framed it had begun to fade, replaced by something far more complex, something that could not be dismissed or overruled. Emma did not pause now. She continued, her voice calm, but carrying a clarity that filled the room. And when the source of authorization is called into question, she added, her eyes meeting his directly, the responsibility for that authorization must also be examined. The implication was no longer distant, no longer implied. It was present, immediate, unavoidable. The room seemed to hold its breath, not in anticipation, but in recognition. The final connection had been drawn, and it pointed not outward, but inward, toward the bench itself. The prosecutor remained completely still, no longer attempting to speak, because there was nothing left to defend. The narrative had shifted beyond recovery. Judge Harrington exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering briefly before returning to meet hers. And in that moment, something undeniable passed between them, not resistance, not control, but awareness, the kind that comes when a structure you believed unshakable begins to reveal its fractures. Emma did not raise her voice. She did not press further. She simply allowed the conclusion to exist, complete in its logic, complete in its clarity. And as the silence stretched, deep and unbroken, it became clear to everyone present that this was no longer a matter of argument. It was a moment of reckoning, one that could not be avoided, and one that would define everything that followed. The moment did not explode into chaos. It settled into something far more powerful, a silence so complete that even the faintest movement felt amplified. And as Emma Carter stood there without speaking, the conclusion she had built now existed on its own, undeniable and unshaken. Judge Harrington did not respond immediately. His posture remained upright, composed, but the stillness in his expression carried a weight that had not been there before. The kind that comes when certainty is no longer an option. His eyes moved once across the documents, then returned to Emma, slower this time, more deliberate. "This court operates under established procedures," he said finally, his voice controlled, but no longer absolute. "And any assertion regarding those procedures must be supported with clear and direct evidence." The statement was careful, not a rejection, but an attempt to hold the line between implication and proof. Emma inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the standard without hesitation. "Of course, Your Honor," she replied calmly, her voice steady. "And that is precisely why I requested access to the authorization logs prior to this hearing." A subtle shift moved through the room, not surprise, but recognition, as if a missing piece had just been quietly placed into position. Judge Harrington's gaze narrowed slightly, the first visible sign that something had moved beyond his expectation. "Authorization logs are internal records," he said, his tone measured. "They are not typically introduced without cause." Emma did not react to the resistance. She simply continued, her composure unchanged. "They were provided under formal request, approved 3 days ago," she said, her eyes steady. "And they confirmed that each document in question was authorized using a judicial override credential." The words landed softly, but their impact carried across the entire room. The prosecutor remained completely still, his earlier presence now reduced to silence, because there was nothing left to redirect. "A credential that requires direct access," Emma added, her tone even, "and cannot be executed without personal authentication." The room held its breath, the logic unfolding not in leaps, but in precise, unavoidable steps. Judge Harrington's fingers pressed lightly against the bench, then stilled, his gaze fixed now, not shifting, not searching, simply present, as if he understood that every word spoken from this point forward would carry consequence. Emma took a slow breath, not out of hesitation, but to mark the moment, to allow the structure she had built to fully settle before completing it. "There are no secondary approvals recorded," she continued, her voice calm. "No delegated access, no external authorization." She paused, just long enough for the absence to be understood. "Only a single point of entry." The words did not accuse, they revealed, and in doing so, they removed the final space for denial. The silence that followed was absolute, not fragile, not uncertain, but complete, the kind that comes when a truth no longer needs to be argued. Judge Harrington did not speak, not immediately. His gaze lowered briefly, then lifted again, meeting Emma's with a stillness that carried something new, something unspoken but unmistakable. And in that moment, the distance between authority and accountability disappeared entirely, because what stood before the court was no longer a question of what had happened, but who had allowed it to happen. And for the first time, that answer was no longer hidden behind procedure. It was standing in plain sight. Waiting to be acknowledged. No one spoke, not because they were waiting, but because there was nothing left to interrupt. The truth had already arrived, quiet and complete, and it now stood in the center of the courtroom where authority once dominated. Judge Harrington remained still, his posture unchanged, but the presence that once filled the room had shifted into something far more restrained, something measured, his eyes no longer scanning for control but holding steady as if acknowledging what could no longer be redirected. Emma Carter did not move, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression calm, not triumphant, not relieved, simply certain. The kind of certainty that does not need to be announced because it has already been understood. The prosecutor remained silent. His role dissolved into the background as the structure he had relied on had fully collapsed under its own weight. Judge Harrington exhaled slowly. The sound, barely audible but unmistakable in the stillness. "The court will take a moment to review the presented information," he said, his voice controlled, but no longer commanding. It was the first time he had stepped back rather than forward, and that alone shifted everything. The clerk nodded quietly, organizing the documents that had once seemed routine, now carrying a different gravity. Each page no longer a tool of accusation, but a record of how easily process could be bent when no one expected. It to be questioned, Emma's gaze lowered briefly, not in submission, but in quiet reflection, as if the moment was not about victory, but about completion. The room remained silent, every person present aware that what they had witnessed was not simply a defense, but a dismantling, precise and controlled, built on nothing more than clarity and patience. Judge Harrington reviewed the documents carefully, not quickly, not dismissively, but with the kind of attention that had been absent at the beginning, his eyes moving line by line, tracing the very path Emma had revealed, and with each second that passed, the distance between what had been assumed and what had been proven grew impossible to ignore. No one shifted in their seat. No one whispered. The silence held, firm and unbroken, until finally Harrington placed the documents down, his hands resting on the bench, steady but no longer dominant. He looked up, his gaze meeting Emma's, and for the first time, there was no hierarchy in that exchange, no elevation, no dismissal, only recognition. The integrity of this case has been called into serious question, he said, his voice measured, each word deliberate, and the court cannot proceed on a foundation that lacks verifiable consistency. The statement was not dramatic, but it carried more weight than anything spoken before, because it did not defend, it acknowledged. A quiet ripple moved through the room, not noise, but release, the kind that comes when uncertainty finally gives way to clarity. Emma did not react outwardly. She did not smile. She did not speak. She simply stood as she had from the beginning, steady and composed, as if the outcome had never been the goal, only the truth. Judge Harrington's gaze lowered briefly, then returned to the documents, and in that moment, something became unmistakably clear to everyone present. The authority that once shaped the room had been forced to answer to something greater than itself, not through force, not through defiance, but through precision. And as the silence settled once more, deeper now, calmer, it was no longer the silence of tension, but the silence of understanding, because what had been revealed could not be undone, and what had been understood could no longer be ignored. The courtroom did not erupt. It exhaled, a quiet release that moved through every seat, every breath, as if something long held had finally been set down. And in the center of it all stood Emma Carter, unchanged, unmoved, as though the outcome had never been about proving anything to anyone else. Judge Harrington remained seated, his posture still composed, but the weight of the moment had reshaped the space around him. The authority that once defined his presence now tempered by something deeper, something quieter. He looked out across the room, not as a figure above it, but as someone within it. This case is hereby dismissed due to insufficient and compromised evidence, he said, his voice steady, each word deliberate, not rushed, not forced, but grounded in a reality that could no longer be denied. A subtle murmur followed, not loud, not chaotic, but filled with recognition, the kind that comes when something unexpected reveals itself as undeniable truth. Emma did not react outwardly. She did not celebrate. She did not speak. She simply inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the decision with the same calm dignity she had carried from the beginning. The prosecutor gathered his documents slowly, his earlier certainty now replaced with quiet restraint, no longer attempting to reclaim what had already been lost. Judge Harrington's gaze shifted once more to the papers before him, then back to Emma, and for a brief moment, something passed between them that did not require words, not apology, not justification, but recognition, the kind that lingers long after the moment itself has ended. Emma turned, her steps measured, unhurried, the sound of her heels against the polished floor soft but steady, echoing gently through the space that had once tried to diminish her. No one stopped her, no one questioned her, because there was nothing left to question. The truth had already spoken, and it had done so without raising its voice. As she reached the doors, she paused for just a fraction of a second, not to look back, but as if marking the end of something that no longer needed to follow her. Then she stepped forward, the doors opening quietly, allowing light from the outside to spill into the room behind her. And just like that, she was gone, leaving behind not silence, but understanding. Judge Harrington remained seated, his hands resting on the bench, no longer gripping, no longer holding, simply present. The weight of the moment settling not as defeat, but as something far more enduring, a reminder that authority does not define truth, and that even the quietest voice, when grounded in clarity, can reshape an entire room. The courtroom slowly returned to motion, people rising, papers gathering, conversations beginning again, but something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, because what had been witnessed could not be unseen, and as the light from the open doors faded back into stillness, one truth remained, steady and unshaken. That day was not remembered for power or for position, but for the moment when dignity stood its ground, and the world, for once, chose to listen.